There's a moment, somewhere between the bank statement and the realization that follows, where you stop being a person and become a punchline. I know that moment intimately. I've lived inside it. I've turned it over in my hands like a smooth stone you find on a beach, polishing it with repetition until it shines. My name is Raymond Cooper. I'm 66 years old. I'm a business owner from Vancouver who spent 22 months funding a domestic arrangement that I wasn't even a participant in. While I was wiring money to Kanya every month for rent, utilities, food, and what I generously referred to as living expenses, a man named Arthit was sleeping in my bed, eating food I'd paid for, and using the internet connection I was covering. The apartment I was bankrolling was his home. I was just the subscription service that kept the lights on. I've told this story twice now. Once to a friend at a bar in Pattaya, who laughed so hard he spilled his chang down his shirt. Once to a therapist back in Vancouver who did not laugh but who charged me 220 Canadian dollars for the hour anyway. Both reactions felt appropriate. Both felt completely inadequate. I'm telling it again now because I've decided the funniest stories are the ones that destroy you. I came to Thailand the way a lot of men in their 60s come to Thailand. My marriage had ended 3 years earlier, quietly, without drama, just two people who had gradually become strangers deciding to formalize the arrangement. My kids were grown. My business, a mid-sized HVAC supply company in Vancouver, ran itself well enough that I could afford to be away for months at a time. I had money and no particular reason to stay in one place. A friend who'd been living in Chiang Mai for 2 years told me I should come see what the rest of my life could look like. I went for 3 weeks. I stayed for 6 months. And then I met Kanya, which is when things got genuinely interesting, in the way that a car fire is interesting. She was 28. I was 64 at the time, which means the math was never subtle, but I have never been a man who appreciates subtlety in mathematics or in personal relationships. She was working at a bar on Soi Buakhao, which I want to be clear about because it's important for what comes later. She was not hidden from me. The context was not ambiguous. I was a man in his mid-60s sitting at a bar in Pattaya, and she was the woman who brought me drinks and sat with me while I drank them. And within 2 weeks I had paid a bar fine and taken her to dinner, and told myself that this was simply two people getting to know each other in an unusual context, which is the kind of thing a person says to himself when he needs to believe it very badly. The truth is, I knew the math. I just thought I was special enough to beat it. That's the flaw, if I'm being precise about it. Not naivety, not ignorance. Willful blindness dressed up as romantic optimism. I knew what Pattaya was. I knew what a bar on Soi Buakhao was. I knew the age gap, and the economic gap, and the cultural gap, and every other gap that sensible people would have flagged before ordering a second drink. I chose to see past all of it because I was 64 years old and she was beautiful and she laughed at my jokes, and when she put her hand on my arm, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. That's the whole explanation. There's nothing more complicated than that. I wanted it to be real, so I decided it was. The first 3 months were, and I say this without irony, among the happiest of my life. She was warm and funny, and physically present in a way that filled rooms. She had a directness that I found refreshing in a way that was probably just confirmation bias, where I told myself her emotional simplicity was honesty rather than strategic simplification. She told me about her family in Surin, mother, father, 2 younger sisters. She told me she'd been working at the bar for 2 years, that she didn't love it, that she'd ended a relationship with a Thai man named Arthit 6 months earlier. She described him as a problem, someone from her past, someone who had taken money from her family and given nothing back. She told me she was glad that part of her life was over. I believed her completely, which, in retrospect, is very funny. By month 4, I was covering half her rent. By month 6, I was covering all of it. I told myself this was care, that providing for someone you love is how love becomes action rather than just feeling. She said she'd quit the bar. She showed me a few days of sleeping in, of being home when I called, of plans that didn't involve Soi Buakhao. I took those few days and extrapolated an entire character transformation from them, which is the kind of analytical error that would embarrass me professionally if I ever made it in a business context. In business, I verify. In love, I apparently just accepted delivery without checking the invoice. We settled into a routine. I was in Pattaya 4 months of the year and back in Vancouver the rest, running the business remotely and flying back when I needed to be present. When I was in Pattaya, she was attentive and affectionate. When I was in Vancouver, she sent voice messages and line photos, and the occasional video call where she'd show me the apartment, tidy and clean, evidence of a life organized around my eventual return. I paid for the apartment. I paid for her phone plan. I sent monthly transfers that she used for food and transportation, and I later learned, for an absolutely spectacular range of things I would never have approved. The apartment was in her name because that's how it worked practically. Because a 64-year-old Canadian man cannot easily hold a lease in Pattaya, because she was the one living there full-time. That practicality would later reveal itself as one of the great structural jokes of my romantic life. The first thing I noticed, around month 14, was that the apartment looked different on video calls. Small things. A different coffee cup on the counter that I hadn't bought. A pair of flip-flops near the door that were clearly too large to be hers. She explained the flip-flops as belonging to her cousin who'd been visiting from Surin. She explained the coffee cup as a gift from a coworker, which I accepted without question because accepting it without question was much easier than not accepting it. My eye twitched for the first time around this period, though I didn't connect the two things until much later. Just a little spasm under my left eye, the kind your body produces when it knows something your mind is refusing to process. The phone came next. She had always been fairly open with her phone, leaving it on the counter, answering calls in the same room. Somewhere in month 15, the phone started going everywhere with her. To the bathroom, to the bedroom when she slept, placed face down on every surface, reflexively, the way you develop habits you don't know you have. I asked about it once, casually, trying to keep the question light. She said she'd dropped it twice and was trying to protect the screen. This explanation was so simple and so plausible that I was briefly embarrassed for noticing. Then there were the nights. I was in Pattaya from January through April of that year, and I began to notice that on Tuesday and Thursday evenings she was consistently somewhere that was not with me. She was visiting her friend Nong, she said. Nong was going through a difficult time with her boyfriend. Kanya was being a good friend. I appreciated this framing because it positioned her unavailability as evidence of her good character, which is an elegant piece of narrative construction when you think about it. Making your suspicious absences proof of your virtue is a skill I admire even as I resent having been subject to it. By month 17, something had calcified in the back of my mind that I could not dissolve with logic. I am not an emotional man by nature. I run a business. I read balance sheets. I think in terms of evidence and outcomes, and I pride myself on not making decisions based on feelings I haven't interrogated. But the feeling I was carrying by that spring had survived every interrogation I subjected it to. Something was wrong. I couldn't make the math work in any direction that felt clean. The flip-flops, the phone, the Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the way she laughed differently on calls when I was in Vancouver, a different register, like she was performing the laugh rather than having it. I'm telling you about a coffee cup and a pair of flip-flops and a phone screen, and I understand how that sounds. But when you know someone well enough, when you've paid close attention to the texture of their daily life for almost 2 years, the anomalies are visible even when they're small. I did not hire a private investigator, though I considered it. I did not install tracking software, though I looked at options. What I did was something more mundane and more revealing. I was reviewing my personal accounts one evening in Vancouver, cross-referencing transfers and expenses the way I do quarterly, and I pulled up the records from the previous 6 months. This was routine. I do this with my business accounts, and I do it with my personal accounts, because information is the thing that keeps you from making expensive mistakes. Except, of course, I had already made the expensive mistake. I was just now reading the receipt. The bank statement showed, as I expected, the monthly transfers to Kanya's account, but I have a linked credit card that I'd given her for, as she described it, emergencies. I had never closely examined the itemized charges because they had always seemed reasonable. Groceries, a pharmacy, a phone top-up. But when I pulled the full 12 months of itemized charges and went through them line by line, I found something that didn't fit the landscape. There were hotel charges, not one, 6, spread across 14 months at a hotel in Pattaya I recognized because I'd walked past it a dozen times, a small place on a back Soi near the Buakhao area, not expensive. Not the kind of place you'd charge to a credit card unless you were either careless or completely certain you'd never be caught. The charges were between 800 and 1200 baht each, midweek, Tuesdays and Thursdays. I want to tell you that I had an immediate emotional reaction. I want to say I went cold or went hot or put my fist through a wall. What actually happened is that I sat in my office chair in Vancouver and read the line items again 3 times, very quietly, and then I went to make coffee because I needed to do something with my hands. I stood in my kitchen with the kettle and thought, she's been charging someone else's hotel room to my credit card, the Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The friend Nong with the difficult boyfriend. The card I gave her for emergencies. She was taking a man to a hotel 2 afternoons a week and billing it to me. Here is where a sensible person would have called her immediately, demanded an explanation, ended things cleanly. I did not do that. I have a particular stubbornness when it comes to confirming what I already know, which is that I want the confirmation to be so complete that there is no possible exit from the truth. I didn't want her to tell me a story that I would half believe, because I wanted to half believe it. I needed the version that left no room for interpretation. So I waited 2 days, reviewing everything I could review, building a picture from available evidence the way you'd review a set of accounts you suspected of fraud, which, I now understood, was precisely what I was dealing with. I went back through the line messages she'd sent over the past year, looking at timestamps against what I now knew about the hotel charges. There were gaps in her communication on those Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, periods where she'd gone quiet for 3 or 4 hours, and then returned with cheerful messages about dinner plans or things she'd seen on the street. Normal gaps that I'd never questioned. I thought about the video calls where the apartment had looked slightly different, tidier or slightly less tidy in ways I couldn't articulate, where something in the quality of the air seemed off in the particular way that spaces feel off when someone has just been in them. The coffee cup I hadn't bought, the flip-flops that were too large. I thought about something she'd mentioned once, early in our relationship, very casually, in passing, the way you mention things you don't think matter. She'd told me that Arthit, her ex, had a habit of showing up, that he sometimes came to Pattaya to find her, that he was the kind of person who didn't understand that a relationship was over. She'd framed this as a problem, as evidence that her past was difficult and complicated and that she'd worked hard to leave it behind. I had accepted this framing entirely and filed it under evidence of her good character, which is the same cognitive move I'd made with the Tuesday and Thursday evenings. I was beginning to see a pattern in my own thinking that was less flattering than I would have liked. The night I called her, I was very calm. This surprised me. I had expected anger or grief or some dramatic register. But what I had instead was a kind of settled clarity, the feeling you get when you've been trying to solve a problem for months and the solution has finally presented itself cleanly. She answered on the 3rd ring, happy sounding, doing the things she did with her voice that I used to find charming, that slight uplift at the end of my name that made it sound like she was glad every time she heard from me. I told her I'd been reviewing my accounts. I mentioned the credit card. I read her the dates. There was a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds. I counted. Then she told me that the hotel charges were from when her friend Nong had needed a place to stay for a few nights, that she'd helped pay for it because Nong had been leaving her boyfriend and needed somewhere safe, that she was sorry she hadn't mentioned it. She hadn't thought it was important. The story arrived fully formed, which told me it hadn't been constructed on the spot. She had prepared for a version of this conversation. I told her I'd counted 6 separate charges across 14 months. Another silence. Shorter this time. She said Nong had had a difficult year. I said the charges were on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She said Nong didn't have a regular schedule. I said I wanted to talk about Arthit. This is the silence I remember most specifically, the one that came after I said his name. It was a different quality from the others, less calculated, more physiological. The sound of a story that has run out of road. She said Arthit was her past. She said I knew about him. She said she'd told me about him early in the relationship. This was true, and she knew I couldn't use it against her without looking like I was punishing her for honesty, which was a very good piece of positioning that she'd apparently maintained for 22 months against the possibility of exactly this conversation. I told her I thought he might be living in the apartment I was paying for. She said I was crazy. The word came fast, almost reflexive, the first real tell in a conversation that had otherwise been quite controlled. You crazy, Raymond. Why you think crazy things like this? That break in her English, that particular register, the way stress pulled her back toward more economical grammar. She'd always had near-perfect English when she was composed. When she wasn't composed, she simplified. I said I was going to call the landlord. She told me not to do that. The tone had changed by now. The warmth was gone, replaced by something more pragmatic and considerably less warm. You don't need to call him. You don't understand the situation. I asked her to explain the situation to me. She said it was complicated. I said I had time. What came out over the next 40 minutes was not a confession, so much as a gradual erosion of positions. First she admitted that Arthit had visited, then that he'd visited frequently, then that he had stayed for periods when I was in Vancouver. Then, when I told her I was going to ask the landlord directly, and that the landlord could review his own records of who had been using the apartment, she stopped managing the conversation and just stopped. A silence that conceded the field without formally surrendering it. She told me it wasn't what I thought. I asked her what it was then. She said they had history, that he was family to her in a way I couldn't understand because I wasn't Thai, that her relationship with him was complicated and old, and not something she could explain to a farang who didn't understand how things worked between Thai people who had known each other their whole lives. This was the cultural defense, deployed at the moment when direct denial had become untenable. I want to acknowledge that it was reasonably executed. Under other circumstances, I might have even found it persuasive. I said, because by this point I was operating in that clean, flat register where emotion had simplified into pure clarity. He's been living there, hasn't he? Not visiting. Living there. She didn't answer. I said, I've been paying his rent. She said, it's complicated, and there it was. Not an admission exactly, but the first sentence in 22 months that wasn't a lie. I want to tell you there was a dramatic moment of release. There wasn't. There was just that sentence hanging in the air between Vancouver and Pattaya, and me sitting in my kitchen at 11 in the evening thinking about how many months of rent I'd paid and how many hotel afternoons I'd funded and how, completely, I had arranged my own deception through the simple mechanism of wanting very badly to not be deceived. The most elegant cons are the ones where the mark does most of the work himself. I had done exceptional work. I called the landlord the next day. He was, to his credit, genuinely apologetic about the whole thing, which suggested he felt he owed me an honest accounting since I was the one who'd been depositing money into his account for nearly 2 years. He confirmed that there had been a man staying regularly at the apartment. He didn't know the man's name. He knew he wasn't Western. He'd assumed he was a family member or a boyfriend, and since Kanya had always paid rent on time, he hadn't asked questions. He mentioned, with the specific awkwardness of a man delivering information he knows is painful, that the man had been there consistently for at least the last year, possibly longer. I have turned those 2 words over in my hands quite a bit since then. I did the reconstruction that you inevitably do in the days after something like this, when you go back through the archive of a relationship looking for the moments you misread in real time. The flip-flops near the door, early in month 15, were now obviously not a cousin's. The Tuesday and Thursday evenings were now hotel time, which meant the rest of the week he was in the apartment, in my bed, watching television I'd paid for, eating food I'd funded. The new phone she'd shown me once, casually, saying a friend had helped her upgrade, was likely a gift from him, purchased with my money through the circuitous logic of my monthly transfers. I had paid for her to have a better phone to coordinate with the man I was paying to house. My left eye twitched for 6 weeks after this, not metaphorically. Literally, a small muscle under my left eye that convulsed approximately every 3 minutes for 6 weeks straight, which my doctor confirmed was stress-related. No, I told him. I know exactly what it's related to. He charged me $180 and told me to reduce my workload. I want to be precise about the comedy of it because I think precision is important. It isn't funny that she cheated. Plenty of people cheat, and there's nothing inherently funny about infidelity. What is funny, in the way that the worst things are funny, is the specific geometry of my situation. I was not just being cheated on. I was the financial infrastructure supporting the alternative arrangement. The other man wasn't competing with me for her attention in some romantic triangle. He was living in a house I paid for, in a city I visited 4 months a year, waiting for me to leave so he could come home. I was, functionally, his landlord. He had never met me and had no reason to think about me at all except as the mechanism that kept the lights on and the refrigerator stocked. In terms of household economics, I was something between a utility company and a municipal service. I was Pattaya City Water, and he was just a guy who turned on the tap. I did not contact Kanya again after the landlord call. I canceled the monthly transfers. I canceled the credit card. I sent her a single line message that said, "I've spoken with the landlord. I understand the situation now. I won't be in contact again." She responded 3 times over the following 2 weeks. The first message expressed hurt and confusion. The second expressed anger and contained several observations about my character that I found unpersuasive. The third was a request for money for a deposit on a new apartment, sent with a cheerfulness that I found genuinely impressive in its audacity. I did not respond to any of them. I'm back in Vancouver now, running my company, looking at balance sheets that tell me things that are true. I went back to Pattaya once, briefly, about 4 months later, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. I didn't go near Soi Buakhao. I didn't look for her. I didn't want confirmation of what came next for her because I had already figured out what came next for her. She would find another arrangement. She was organized and resourceful, and she understood her market. She would find another Raymond, probably not from Canada, probably not 64, but structurally identical. A Western man with a comfortable income and a strong need to believe he was special and a talent for ignoring the evidence in front of him. He would pay the rent. Arthit would come home. The whole mechanism would continue running exactly as designed. What I've learned, and I mean this without any bitterness that I'm not fully entitled to, is that you cannot separate the origins of a thing from the thing itself. I met Kanya in a bar on Soi Buakhao because that is where she was working, and I was the kind of man who ended up at bars on Soi Buakhao. That context is not something you transcend through sincerity or money or willingness to believe. It follows the relationship the way a shadow follows a person. I wanted to believe that my specific love was strong enough to make the context irrelevant. It wasn't. And I knew that going in, which is the part that makes it genuinely funny and completely my own fault. I'm 66 now. I have a good business and a reasonable life and a left eye that has finally stopped twitching. I look back at Raymond Cooper, age 64, sitting in a bar in Pattaya, telling himself that this was different, that he was different, that the math didn't apply to him specifically. And I feel for that man, the particular tenderness you feel for someone who is about to walk into a door. He's trying so hard. He wants it so much. He has no idea that somewhere in that city, a man named Arthit is waiting for him to go back to Vancouver. Here's what I want to say to you directly, because I think you may be sitting somewhere right now doing your own version of the math. If you are sending money to someone you love in Thailand, go back through the itemized charges, not the totals, the line items, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, hotel names you recognize. Cash withdrawals on days she says she was home. The money tells you things that conversation won't. It is patient and specific, and it cannot be explained away. If she said she quit, and you've never verified that she quit, she probably hasn't quit. Not all the way. Not completely. The bar is not something you quit for someone. It's something you quit for yourself when you're ready, and most of the time you're not ready just because someone who loves you wants you to be. If there are flip-flops near the door that aren't hers and aren't yours, ask about the flip-flops. Ask directly, the first time, not 6 months later. Ask while the information is still deniable And watch what happens when you ask. The answer will tell you everything. The age gap matters. I know you've told yourself it doesn't, that love is universal and connection transcends arithmetic. I told myself the same thing with great conviction for 22 months. The gap matters not because she can't feel real affection for you, she very possibly can, but because the economic reality of that gap creates a structural problem that goodwill cannot dissolve. She is young. You are not. You have money. She is building a future. These are not romantic obstacles. They are practical conditions that shape behavior, regardless of what anyone feels. And finally, if your gut has been telling you something for 3 months, and you've been explaining it away, and it's still there, and you've explained it away again, and it's still there, that is not paranoia. That is information. Your gut is not insecure. Your gut has reviewed the evidence and reached a conclusion and is waiting with enormous patience for the rest of you to catch up. I would have saved myself roughly 8 months of confusion and an amount of money I choose not to calculate precisely if I had listened to my gut in month 14 instead of month 22. Looking back on it now, from a comfortable distance, with my left eye still and my balance sheet clean and my sense of humor more or less intact, I can say that it's almost funny. Almost. The old Canadian man, paying the bills, funding the whole operation, flying back to Vancouver like clockwork so the apartment could return to its actual function. I was, without knowing it, running a very efficient housing subsidy program for a man I never met. If she still has your credit card, check the hotel charges. I promise they're there.